Throughout history, dolls have been used as a tool to teach growing children ways in which we can care for those more vulnerable than us. Even in our digital age, children still have their favourite teddies, toys, or figures that give them joy and comfort on a daily basis. They're given names and specific personality traits, with some children even having conversations with them, as if the doll is actively listening. A child often wants to mimic what their parents do, and so it makes sense that they'd like having something smaller than them to look after, which is something they would have commonly experienced so far in their lives. The faces of most dolls are so human-like that it becomes the perfect toy for a child to pretend it's a baby of their own, something they're responsible for and need to look after. What's interesting about these faces, though, is that as we grow, our perception of them often completely changes. To an adult, a doll's face is extremely human-like, signaling to our brains that it's alive. Their smiles don't move, their eyes don't blink. Yet at times, it can feel as though their eyes are looking directly into yours. Our brains are wired to scan for life and intention. It is a key way in which we have survived for so long. A doll's realism can trigger that familiarity whilst giving no sign of true life or intention. And it is in this middle ground that our unease resides. Ultimately, we know that they're nothing but inanimate objects. Therefore, that discomfort rarely grows into legitimate fear, staying as a mild discomfort that many of us feel. However, it is due to this discomfort that is so common around the world that when stories of a doll having the ability to move from one room to another or cause harm to those who get too close, it is no wonder that people begin to take notice. My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is Annabelle. Our connections to dolls can be found across numerous cultures and years of history worldwide. In ancient Egypt, execration figurines were inscribed with the names of those considered threats, then broken and buried to harm them, with early examples from the late Old Kingdom. In Heian period Japan, paper or straw effigies called shitogata were used for purification. Early rites burned or discarded the figure. Other customs emerged later, in which small dolls were floated away to carry off misfortune and tied into mid-year rites such as Nagoshi no Oharai. In the Congo region, Nikisikonde power figures took nails or blades to seal oaths and call down justice. In South Asia, the Dussehra festival sees towering Ravana effigies set alight after Ram Leela, a public burning that stages the defeat of evil. In Britain, we used what are known as poppets. From the 1600s into the 1800s, poppets were made from cloth, wax, clay, straw, or rushes, and often were packed with hair, nail clippings, or scraps of clothing to link the figure to a person. Typical details included stitched names, a pinned red fabric heart, and bound limbs with herbs sewn inside and pins or thorns pushed into key spots. They could be found in chimney breasts, under floorboards, inside cottage walls, and at thresholds. Some were instead left floating on running water for healing, whilst others were scorched or pierced to curse. In 1692 at Salem, testimony against Bridget Bishop included a deposition from John and William Bly stating that about 7 years earlier, whilst taking down a cellar wall in a house that Bishop had formerly lived in, they found several poppets made up of rags and hogs, bristles with headless pins in them that points outward. That deposition sits in the surviving court papers, even as much of the case hinged on spectral claims. Use of image magic and village healing persisted into the early 1700s, but prosecutions waned. Parliament's Witchcraft Act of 1735, which was put in force from the 24th of June 1736, recast the claims of witchcraft as fraudulent, ending death penalties and marking the legal shift that closed the trials era. This quickly became the widely accepted opinion on the matter, and by the 1800s, opinions had shifted from magical remedies and begun to focus on the growing world of medicine and science. Nowadays, these practices sit mostly in niche circles worldwide. The best known image in modern day is the voodoo doll, a pop culture mashup that owes more to European poppets and Hollywood than Haitian voodoo itself. That said, related doll magic does exist in New Orleans folk practice and hoodoo, often called doll babies, but that is a different lineage entirely. The effigies used throughout our history now sit behind glass within museums, demonstrating a different time with vastly different beliefs. That being said, to this very day, stories involving the spirit world and dolls are continuing to spread. In my telling of an encounter with Annabelle, we will follow Christian, who after a divorce has moved into an old house. Christian stood in the middle of what would be his living room, studying the few cardboard boxes he had stacked against the corner. It had been a long day getting here, and now that he wasn't distracted by packing and travelling, it truly sunk in just how alone he now was. Out in the middle of nowhere, in Connecticut of all places. He had been in the area a couple of times whilst touring his recent stand-up routine through 66 and 67, but had never really explored the state. It wasn't his vibe. He had always dreamt of the California sun whilst growing up in Minnesota. So, when he moved there with his ex-wife, he truly felt all his dreams had come true. He was on television, performing in front of large audiences and married to a beautiful model. What more could he have wanted? Unfortunately, even with all of this, he found it wasn't enough to fill the void he had always felt, and no amount of beauty, money, or fame was going to help it. Perhaps this is why he continued the affairs he knew would crush his wife if she ever found out. Which, of course, she did. This move was intended to be a fresh start after the divorce. A new movie was going into production in the area, and he had nabbed himself a small but important role, potentially creating a whole new avenue for his career, opening a fresh chapter for his life along with it. It was January 1968, a new year and a new adventure for an aging comedian keen to stay relevant so he could find a glimmer of happiness. That adventure was going to have to take a slight break though, as he found himself swiftly falling asleep, still fully dressed on the mattress of a bed he hadn't yet put together. It must have been around 3 a.m. when he woke up again, although he was only guessing based on the positioning of the moon outside. He wasn't happy to be up, standing by the window watching the treetops outside swirl in the stormy winds. It hadn't begun to rain yet, but the lightning had begun to light up the skies in the far distance as the clouds slowly crept over the moon. The house was old and somewhat disheveled, which he liked about it. He even joked that a damaged house is easier to buy, just like the woman in his life. That was the kind of comedy he liked to tell. And although he was mostly poking fun, he often meant what he was saying, at least in some capacity. He really did love the house. But the creaking and moaning that came with the old wood in a storm had already woken him up from his sleep, which had given him reason to reconsider his decisions. The wind was growing stronger outside, with the moon now fully engulfed by the storm's arrival, darkening his surroundings even more so than before. But as the walls of the house creaked once more, something stood out to him as odd. Amongst its moans and groans, he could hear gentle taps scurrying across the floor above, as if a toddler was making its way across the ceiling. Christian stepped away from the window and flicked the light switch on the wall, instantly illuminating the room in a dull, yellow glow. He pondered on it, considering the possibilities of what it could be, still scurrying around above. He hadn't even yet gone into the attic, and he had no idea what to expect. The most logical explanation was that it was likely to be a raccoon or bird of some sort, making its way under shelter due to the heavy storm that was growing outside. He wasn't going to get back to sleep now, and being so far out and alone, it wasn't like he could ask for help. Why would he anyway? He was a grown man, the man of the house. The only one of the house. That's what Christian reminded himself of, as he pulled the latch of the attic down into the hall, stepping back as the wooden ladder slid down and banged against the wooden floor. He stared up at the black square above his head, full of mystery and darkness. And for a moment, he felt the heavy drop of fear in his stomach. Maybe it'd be better to do this in the daytime, he considered. But then again, the attic was going to be pitch black no matter what. He mentally had a word with himself, filled with unkind rants and hateful words, as he convinced himself that there was no reason not to go up. And so, in the middle of a dark storm, Christian climbed up the ladder and flicked on the bulb that hung in the middle of the attic. Now he was there, the fear had quickly faded, replaced instead by a significant level of annoyance as he studied the large number of boxes that had been left behind by the previous owner, taking up his space. He sighed in frustration, pacing forward and opening one of them, revealing nothing but files, rusty old office supplies, and several children's drawings that once belonged on a fridge somewhere. If they were going to leave stuff for him, they could have at least made sure it was sellable, he thought to himself. Hell, he would have even settled for interesting. He dropped the pictures back into the box and closed it up, ready to have a nose in the next, when the little footsteps scurried behind once again. He sharply turned, clanking his head against the hanging bulb, causing it to violently swing from side to side. Christian rubbed his forehead, laughing to himself as he continued to study across the room. But then, as he looked out, his smile quickly faded. In the distance, he could see what looked to be two large eyes watching him from the shadows, slightly lit by the bulb as it swung towards it, disappearing into darkness as the bulb swung away. In a moment of panic, he grabbed the bulb, holding it still so he could see the corner of the room with more clarity. But now, there was nothing to be seen. Cautiously, he edged closer, each step a little slower than the previous, as he peered around the boxes one more time. And that is when he finally looked upon her for the first time. It was a doll, sitting on the floor, propped up against a wooden pillar. Her hair was scraggly and bright red, her eyes wide and friendly, her smile mild-mannered and gentle. He kneeled down in front of her, studying her with curiosity as he realized that these were the eyes he'd been seen watching him, although there was no denying that she would have had to have somehow traveled across the room for that to be true. But then he was very tired and freaking himself out, so perhaps he'd simply made a mistake. By 8 a.m., Everything that was once abandoned in the attic was now resting by the front door. The storm was still blowing outside, although the worst of it had passed. That said, the sky was still full of dark grey clouds, blanketing over the sunshine that would so often beat down on him in his California home. His eyes felt dry and heavy, whilst his mind filled with fog. But he had kept himself busy, trying to tire himself out so he could sleep better later in the day. First, he put together his bed. Next, he unpacked all of his boxes, placing them where they needed to be. By 1 p.m, his sofa and the other pieces of furniture had been delivered, finally giving him a place to sit down and rest. Although, instead of doing so, he found himself going through the many boxes he had found in the attic, hoping to find anything of note. This was a dud though, and so he packed everything into a few boxes and wrote "thrift store" across the top, ready to be dropped off when he got the chance. Christian didn't eat much once again that day, instead sipping on his whiskey as he lay on the sofa, spitballing ideas for jokes as his nifty reel-to-reel recorder whirred on the floor beside him. At least, that was meant to be the plan. Instead, he found himself waking up at 3 a.m. once again, his empty glass of whiskey resting across the floor, the reel-to-reel recorder lying silently beside it. He rubbed his eyes, sitting up in a confused state. He had slept deeply, deeper than he had in a very long time, suggesting that he must have needed it. He laughed to himself, clicking rewind on the tape as he flicked on the newly delivered floor lamp beside him. Outside, the wind had gone, with the distant trees now perfectly still, as if the world itself had paused. The tape had hit the beginning of its reel, and so, of course, he wanted to hear at what point he had fallen asleep. Over the next 15 minutes, Christian listened to himself as he poured another whiskey, critiquing his own words as if they were in the same room together. But then, as he expected, the voice on the recording began to slow and mumble, until eventually he had fully fallen asleep. He laughed to himself as he swigged back his whiskey, pacing forward to stop the tape. But before his finger could reach the button, he began to hear a strange sound emitting from its speakers. A curious, scraping sound in the distance. He kneeled down beside it, turning the volume dial as far as it could go as he listened out for what it could be. But then he realized it was the sound of cardboard boxes opening. With that realization, he turned to look down into the hallway where the boxes had been sitting in the darkness. And sure enough, one of them was now open. He got to his feet, his eyes fixated on the boxes as he studied them, unsure on what this could even mean. Maybe a mouse or something had gotten inside. That's what he questioned, although something in his gut knew that this was not going to be the case. He stepped forward into the doorway, his hand hovering over the lamp as if ready to grab it if need be. And that is when he saw her once more. The doll was no longer packed away in her box. Now, she was standing above them, seemingly watching him. How this was possible, he didn't know. How was she able to stand on her own? It was then that Christian finally saw it. A large, lurking shadow just behind the doll in the darkness. It was holding the doll in place, its faint, white glowing eyes watching his every move. He wanted to scream. He wanted to do anything to escape, but it was too late. How is a mortal man ever to escape such an evil presence? He had seen it, and in turn, it had seen him. By the end of the month, all of his belongings had been once again boxed up, this time to be given to loved ones in case they wanted to keep any memories they may hold. They refused, though, with no need for any of the few items he had with him in his new home. And so, instead, all of it was given to the local thrift stores, along with the boxes he had kept by the door. It was crushing for his many fans to find out that their beloved comedian had suffered a fatal heart attack so suddenly in his home, found days later by a would-be colleague who had come to check in on him. Many in the area had laid flowers outside his house as a mark of respect, a shrine to his fame and popularity. Many would wish they could have met him, or perhaps even had gotten an autograph, completely unaware that if they simply visited the local thrift stores, they'd find many souvenirs. Items such as ornaments, a lamp, a reel-to-reel recorder, and even a red-haired, innocent-looking, unnamed doll. While horror movies may have dramatically reimagined and amplified the doll's reported sinister presence, the real case behind the Hollywood dramatization offers a fascinating glimpse into America's paranormal investigation history. The real Annabelle story is often stated to have begun in the year of 1968. It was Donna who first let Annabelle into her home, at least regarding the timeline of the horrors connected to it. She was a student nurse, living with her friend Angie, also a student nurse. Her mother, whilst out searching for a birthday gift for Donna, made her way into a hobby store where she finally laid eyes on the perfect present. A plain-looking, second-hand Raggedy Ann doll with a wide smile and red yarn-like hair upon its head. Her mother knew her daughter well, it seems, as Donna absolutely adored it. As the days went on, the doll sat happily in Donna's room as she carried on with her studies, with all seemingly normal. That was until the young woman began to notice small but strange factors surrounding Annabelle that both confused and unnerved them. Through the day, Annabelle would be found in ever so slightly different positions, as if she was somehow moving on her own. The doll would be found in ever so slightly different positions, as if she was somehow moving on her own. This was at first put down to something innocuous, like them accidentally knocking her. Although as time went on, the movements became far harder for them to ignore. At first, the doll would be found with its legs crossed or lying down on its own, as if somebody had actively moved them in place. On other occasions, it was found on the floor, as if it had been pushed off the chair she was resting on. Once again, the young woman justified this with normal, everyday, perfectly reasonable explanations, although this began to get harder to do when the doll would not only move its limbs, but its entire body, now appearing in completely different rooms to which it was left. They would later describe times where they would find the doll sitting on the sofa in the living room, rather than on Donna's bed where she had left it. They explained that they would pick her up and put her back into Donna's room, only to find her sitting by the doorway shortly after. It wasn't just them that had caught wind of the strangeness around this doll, though, as a close friend of theirs named Lou found himself extremely unnerved by it. He was the one who made it clear that this doll was either evil or possessed, suggesting that something be done about it at once. Unfortunately, though, the young women who were far more science-led in their worldview refused to take these notions seriously and brushed off Lou's dramatic statements as mere superstition. That was until things grew darker, more unnerving, and far harder to explain away. Eventually, the young woman began to find notes around their apartment, written on parchment paper. This was noteworthy to the young woman, as neither of them were known to use it and therefore had none in the house. What horrified them the most, though, was what was written on the notes themselves. Scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting were the words, "Help me," or "Help us." This was only to be the beginning of the horror's escalation, though. One day, when Donna arrived home from work, she was relieved to find that her doll had remained where she had left it, perched on her bed. Although, as she drew closer to it, she is said to have noticed that upon its hands were the red stains of blood. Some versions describe it as seeping from within the doll itself, while others mention a red liquid that had appeared across its chest and hands. Things had gotten out of hand, growing far too strange for them to ignore it any further, and so the young student nurses called in reinforcements in the guise of a medium. When they arrived, the seance began, giving the medium a chance to put together the pieces that surrounded the mystery of this strange and confusing doll. He would tell them that the land on which their apartment complex was built used to be nothing but a field. And back when that was the case, a 7-year-old girl named Annabelle Higgins was found dead there. The medium would go on to explain that the little girl's spirit had lingered within the field before continuing to linger within the complex once it had been built. He suggested that it was likely due to the little girl liking dolls that she attached herself to it when Donna's mother brought it round for her birthday. He added that Annabelle seemed to feel comfortable with the roommates and actually wanted to stay with them where she could be loved. Interestingly, the aspiring nurses, upon hearing the tragic tale of Annabelle's spirit, decided to let her stay. To them, it was a lost little girl who was looking for some way to communicate, and they couldn't bring it upon themselves to discard her spirit or the physical doll she had chosen to possess. She had been left alone long enough, and they had dedicated their lives to giving people proper care. Why would that change just because the patient was dead? With that, they officially granted Annabelle permission to inhabit the doll and remain as a guest in their home. Unfortunately, though, this newfound sentiment amongst the young woman would be short-lived, as Annabelle would prove herself to be anything but a scared, helpless spirit. Shortly after, Lou had come to visit once again, and as it was getting late, he began to drift off asleep on the sofa, relaxed and tired as often happens. However, this comfort was quickly eradicated when he realized he could now no longer move. His body felt as though it had been pinned in place, whilst his breath seemed to be caught in his throat. He struggled to get up, but couldn't move a muscle, quickly realizing that something was pressing down on him, tightening around his chest and neck as if invisible hands were trying to strangle the life from him. Panic set in as he fought to breathe, convinced he was about to die. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure released. Lou sat upright, gasping for air, his heart pounding with the knowledge that Annabelle had just tried to kill him in his sleep. Even so, Lou would come back again to spend some time with Angie alone not long after. Donna was out that night, so it meant they could hang out together, just the two of them, without distractions. At least, that was the plan. Soon enough, though, they would begin to hear strange movements emanating from inside Donna's supposedly empty bedroom. At first, they were terrified, more focused on the grounded understanding that it was likely an intruder breaking inside. However, it wasn't long before they had come to the realization that it was, in fact, far more likely to be Annabelle. Lou got to his feet and edged closer to Donna's bedroom door, letting Angie know that it was okay and that he was just going to check it out. He pulled the handle and clicked open the door, slowly stepping inside to find Annabelle was now sitting on the armchair instead of the bed where she usually was placed. There seemed to be nobody else inside, and so Lou stepped forward again, studying the doll curiously, waiting to see any sign that it was somehow aware of his presence. But as he moved closer, he began to feel a strange, dreadful feeling creeping over him, as his instincts set off alarm bells that announced that something was inside that room with him. Before he could even register this, though, it is said that he felt a sharp pain on his chest. He would leave the room and slam the door shut behind him, telling Angie to keep away from it as he checked the skin across his torso. Angie let out a gasp as she spotted a series of claw marks raked across his chest as if he had been attacked by a vicious creature. It was clear to them that this must have been Annabelle's doing, who, for some reason, had taken a great disliking to Lou. The scratches looked like nothing they had ever seen before. Strangely enough, even the way in which they healed was off, as they were completely gone within a couple of days, as if it never happened. The young woman had realized that things were now getting dangerous, and they required far more help than they had initially thought. This is what led to the arrival of Father Cook, sometimes said to have been joined by another priest named Father Hagen, who, after carefully studying the home, their stories, and the doll itself, reached out to two people who he knew would be able to help once and for all. Two self-proclaimed demonologists and paranormal investigators by the names of Ed and Lorraine Warren. It was now that the two young student nurses would be told the supposed truth of what was happening, as Ed and Lorraine explained that, in reality, Annabelle Higgins never actually existed. Therefore, no spirit was around to possess the doll. They explained that instead, Annabelle was a completely fabricated story put together by a malevolent force, using the story of a little girl to gain the young woman's sympathies so they would grant it permission to stay. On top of that, the entity had gone so far as to manipulate and move the doll in order to create the illusion of possession to sell the narrative further. You see, as Ed would go on to explain, demons do not truly possess things. They possess people. All this time, the doll had been nothing more than a conduit. Although, most horrifying of all was the explanation as to why the demon was playing these tricks to begin with. It never had any intention of truly possessing the doll itself, and was instead biding its time to possess one of the young women. Ed and Lorraine warned that if the situation had continued for even a couple more weeks, the entity would have likely completely possessed, if not killed, one of them. With that in mind, the Warrens confiscated the doll taking it away with them where it could not hurt the young friends any longer, leaving Father Cook to perform an exorcism on the apartment, just in case any spiritual presence remained. On their way home, the Warrens decided it was best to drive the doll back to their home through the back roads, believing that if they were to take the main route down the motorway, it was likely that the demonic presence would cause an accident in order to stop them and escape. According to them, this proved to be a good call, as even with the occasional sprinkle of holy water upon the doll, the presence managed to cause several problems such as failing brakes and issues with the steering wheel. Even once the Warrens reached their home in Monroe, Connecticut, the disturbances were said to continue. Ed later claimed that Annabelle would be found levitating or moving into different rooms on her own, and due to this, the Warrens had a special case constructed to keep the doll confined inside. A wooden cabinet with a glass door lined with holy water and protective prayers. In here, at least they hoped, the doll could not be controlled any further, and the evil that had attached to it would be limited. On the front of this box, they placed a warning to any who may approach, one that has grown famous over the years, simply stating, "Positively, do not open." From here, Annabelle's story was said to grow even darker still. According to the Warrens' accounts, a priest who had come to visit had dismissed the doll as nonsense, confidently declaring it powerless. It was shortly after this, on his drive back home, that he was said to have lost control of his car and crashed. Luckily for him, he did survive and was okay in the long run. However, the Warrens attributed the accident to Annabelle's influence and saw it as further evidence of her vicious power. Another story tells of a young man who visited the now museum with his girlfriend during a tour of the Warrens' artifacts. It is said that whilst showing off, he banged on Annabelle's case, mocking the doll and daring it to do something. Ed ordered him to leave immediately for 2 reasons. Firstly, due to the disrespect he had shown to the important artifacts around him, and secondly, due to the danger he had now put himself in. They say that later that very same day, while riding his motorcycle, the man suffered a horrible crash and instantly died. His girlfriend, who luckily survived the accident, swore that he had still been joking about Annabelle mere moments before they fell. This is where the legend falls apart though, as there are no names, no dates, no police reports, and no obituaries that pin down either of these cases as reality in any way. These stories live almost entirely in Warren lectures and sympathetic write-ups that repeat the anecdotes without offering a single verifiable thread. And when skeptics picked through the Warrens' best evidence in the 1990s, what they found did not survive basic controls. Time and again, the proofs dissolved into hearsay, shifting testimony, and showmanship. With that in mind, the stories themselves widely vary depending on the sources gathered from. Some place more emphasis on Father Cook's role, whilst others add Father Hagen. Even the later stories, such as the priest's crash and the motorcyclist's death, occasionally switch and swap places amongst different retellings. It's also worth noting that not only are these stories consistently disputed, but so is the very existence of the characters at play. There is, for example, no evidence that either of Father Cook or Father Hagen exist outside of the Annabelle tale. And that's the same regarding those who would later reportedly crash after encounters with the doll. This throws a significant spanner in the claims that surround the story of Annabelle. But most damning of all is the fact that neither Donna nor Angie ever came forward publicly to corroborate their story, with the sources to the entire tale leading straight back to the Warrens. Even so, there are many out there who truly believe in the horrors that surround Annabelle, a doll that demands respect and caution. To believers, these are not ghost stories or urban legends at all. They are further evidence of a dark and dangerous part of our world that many choose to ignore. On the other hand, however, Annabelle is nothing more than a story, a tourist attraction conjured up by frightened young adults and moulded further by con artists. In recent years, her story has expanded further than anyone could have imagined in her earliest days, with her name now being known in households all around the world. Many know the stories surrounding her, from the simpler, true-to-life iterations to the far more dramatic cinematic interpretations. But amongst all of this modern folklore, where does the truth lie? And what could that truth mean to our society? If you're still listening, I know you share my passion for folklore and urban legends. But to keep these stories coming, I need your help. For just £3 a month, you can ensure the show thrives, with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content created. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks, including access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, giving you 8 additional episodes each season, featuring captivating tales such as The Hodag, The Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll also enjoy behind-the-scenes insights, discounts on merchandise, and access to our private community chat, where you can connect directly with me and other urban legend enthusiasts. And as an extra thank you, I randomly feature patrons in upcoming stories, so you could become part of the legends we discuss. Your support isn't just subscribing, it's joining a passionate community dedicated to keeping folklore alive. Your contribution directly fuels the research and production of this show. If you're ready to join, just click the Patreon link in our show notes to subscribe, and I'll see you there. But for now, back to the legend. Annabelle's story was never going to end with her simply locked away in her case. And since the passing of both Warrens, she has gone on tour across America, being the subject of headlines, internet rumors, and even tragedy. Today, Annabelle still remains within the Warren family collection, watched closely and still blessed to ensure the entity within never escapes. For decades, she was kept inside the Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut, where visitors would come face to face with her stitched smile and red yarn hair peering out from behind the glass, beneath the warning etched across her case. In recent years, however, Annabelle's story has continued to grow. In 2019, the town of Monroe shut public visitation to the museum over zoning violations. This was due to the fact that it was technically a residential property being used as a public space without proper permissions. To counter this, Lorraine's daughter and son-in-law, Judy and Tony Sperra, began what they called the Devils on the Run tour, transporting Annabelle and other cursed artifacts around the country for limited showings, led by Tony, who was now the director and public face of the museum. As the tour rolled on, the internet did what it does best, and posts began claiming Annabelle had slipped her case between stops. This was due to the fact that a few of the tour dates didn't list the doll as one of the objects being displayed. From this, people came to the conclusion that she must have gone missing, with various headlines, YouTube thumbnails, and TikTok captions all sharing the chaotic but ultimately exciting concept. It did have, after all the ingredients of a perfect mini-myth inside its larger tale. However, the New England Society of Psychic Research quickly came to ruin the fun and pushed back on the claims. Tony Spera went on record to say the doll was exactly where she should be, under lock and key and supervision, even filming her safely in her container. Interestingly, this isn't the first time the public have heard rumours that Annabelle had escaped over the years, although each time the custodians have come forward to claim that at no point was she ever lost. This wasn't the last time Annabelle would cause a stir in recent years though, as during a stop in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a paranormal investigator named Dan Rivera, who had been assisting with the tour, was found dead in his hotel room. Now, of course, people die all the time, and the official cause was later confirmed to be cardiac related. However, in the shadow of Annabelle's legend, it's easy to see how this was now added to her sinister lore that was now becoming more of a gimmick over a real spiritual threat in the public eye. This would only be solidified further when in 2025, the Warrens' old home, along with the full collection it contained, was passed over to the hands of a comedian, Matt Rife, and YouTuber, Elton Castee. That said, they did want to make it clear that they were not quite purchasing Annabelle. They were instead becoming her official guardians, legally responsible for her and the other artifacts for the next 5 years. This was a strange and surprising turn of events for many following the Warren story, and it garnered mixed reactions, especially when they announced that their intention was to restore the property. Their goal is to reopen the museum and even offer overnight stays to those who wish to confront the haunted objects themselves. It seems as though the horrifying and intimidating way in which Annabelle was once presented is beginning to lose its edge. If you can hire out an Airbnb to hang out with the supposed demonic entities, just how dangerous could it possibly be? To some, it felt as though now the Warrens had passed away, the respect and care that was to be taken with these artifacts was missing. It seemed that now it was far more about making money rather than keeping evil at bay. Now, it could be argued that this is no different than what Ed and Lorraine Warren were truly doing throughout their entire careers. But to the believers, this sale was only bastardizing the Warrens' legacy. Ed Warren was born in 1926 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He would later claim that his childhood was marked by ghostly encounters, strange lights, and shadows that lingered in his family home. Lorraine Moran was born the following year, also in Connecticut, and from an early age described herself as clairvoyant. She said she could see auras and sometimes spirits, though at the time she never had words for what it was. The two would cross paths when they were only teenagers, but fell in love shortly after, getting married in 1945. Soon after that, though, is when they began the journey that would end up defining their lives. By the early 1950s, Ed and Lorraine were venturing into homes across New England, investigating local claims of hauntings. By now, Ed was referring to himself as a demonologist, though he had no formal theological training. Because of this, the self-proclaimed title made him a controversial figure to many in the Catholic Church. Lorraine instead considered herself a medium, one who could sense presences that others could not. Together, they were a powerful duo, going on to form the New England Society for Psychic Research, or NESPA, in 1952. It was through this society that they would document their cases, collect what they believed were cursed artifacts, and eventually filled their basement with the collection that became known as the famous Warren Occult Museum. It was in the 1970s that things truly begun though, as their reputation exploded due to a series of cases that would make headlines across the country. First came Annabelle, a figure that has now become a somewhat mascot of their work. But what truly put them on the map was their part in the Amityville horror. In 1976, Ed and Lorraine entered the home of George and Kathy Lutz, who claimed to have endured terrifying supernatural assaults after moving into the Long Island house where Ronald DeFeo Jr. had murdered his family just a year earlier. It was the Warrens who officially declared the house was infested with evil spirits, adding to the already infamous narrative surrounding the house. However, it is worth noting that over the years, many of the cases surrounding the Amityville horror are contested, as later owners of the house report no unusual activity. In fact, several researchers actively accused the Lutz family of completely fabricating their horror story, suggesting that the Warrens had either intentionally or unintentionally amplified a hoax. Controversy, however, would never slow the couple down, and in the early 1970s, they investigated the Perron family home in Rhode Island. This was the haunting that would decades later inspire the first in the Conjuring franchise. Andrea Perron, who is one of the daughters who lived there at the time, maintains to this very day that the Warrens were right, and that their home truly was plagued by a dark presence. Although skeptics have argued that the Warrens' involvement simply exaggerated the family's suffering, pushing them into the spotlight of paranormal celebrity. In 1977, they even made their way to Enfield, England, to study a family who claimed their council house was haunted by violent poltergeist activity. Ed and Lorraine insisted the case was genuine, pointing to witnesses, photographs, and testimony. However, as was quickly becoming commonplace, British investigators at the time accused the couple of dramatizing the story, with one even suggesting that Ed had openly spoken to them about exploiting the case for fame. Even so, the Enfield poltergeist remains one of the most famous hauntings in the world, woven forever into the Warren story. Throughout their lives, Ed and Lorraine presented themselves not as thrill seekers, but as Catholics working to warn people of the dangers of the demonic. Their lectures filled halls across America, and their books, particularly The Demonologist, cemented the philosophy that evil spirits are very real, seeking above all else to possess and destroy human life. That said, as always, critics were not far behind, and pointed out that the Warrens often worked without proper scientific method, relying instead on personal testimony, theatrical demonstrations, and their own authority as experts. In fact, almost all of their cases collapsed under scrutiny when focused on the contradictions in witness accounts, the sheer lack of any evidence, and the Warrens' growing role in commercial book and film deals. The Conjuring franchise, which has expanded to spin-offs and prequels, was a final victory lap for the couple before they both passed away, with Ed dying on the 23rd of August 2006 and Lorraine on the 18th of April 2019. The Warrens were famous amongst those who followed the spooky stories of our world, believers and horror lovers alike. But outside of that though, their fame became more obscure. Not unheard of by any means, but nowhere near the famous names they would become thanks to the Conjuring series. This was the same for many of their demonic entities, breathing new air into several of their previous cases over the years. In fact, to most, when you mention Annabelle, they do not picture the real-life Annabelle at all, instead focusing on the far more horrifying image of the movie franchise. Here, they had changed her from a cute, cuddly Raggedy Ann doll to a strange, horrifying-looking porcelain doll, partly due to the optics of the film and partly due to copyright infringement. Annabelle, who may be the most famous haunted doll in our history, remains far from being an only child though. Out there are several mysterious dolls that are said to be connected to supernatural beings we will never truly understand. Some sit in museums, some in roadside cabinets, others in shrines or private collections, but they're out there, all with their own stories and intentions. One of the more famous of these haunted dolls goes by the name of Robert, whose story begins in Key West, Florida, at the turn of the 20th century. The doll first came into the possession of a young boy named Robert Eugene Otto, known simply as Gene, sometime around 1904. The exact origins of the doll remain disputed, with some saying it was given to him by a servant employed by the Otto family, who supposedly disliked Gene's parents and used black magic to curse it. Others, however, suggest that it was nothing more sinister than a handcrafted gift purchased by Gene's mother from the Steiff Company in Germany, a well-known maker of toys at the time. Whatever the case, Robert would prove itself to be no ordinary toy in Gene's eyes. Gene named the doll Robert after himself, and quickly grew inseparable from it. Robert was quite large, nearly the size of a child itself, dressed in a sailor's outfit that mirrored Gene's own, and with beady, lifeless eyes that seemed to watch everything. Gene spoke to Robert constantly, and his parents would often overhear him whispering with the doll in long, drawn-out conversations. At first, they assumed their son was simply playing make-believe and replying as Robert as kids sometimes do. That was until they began to hear a second voice emitting from the doll, one distinctly deeper than Gene's. Over time, strange things began to occur in the Otto household. Gene would be discovered surrounded by overturned furniture, broken toys, or scattered belongings. And whenever his parents asked what had happened, Gene's answer was always the same. Robert did it. Neighbors even began reporting that at night, they could see the doll moving from window to window when the family was away, as if someone or something was walking it through the house. The disturbances didn't calm as Gene grew older though. In fact, it was quite the contrary. Visitors would claim that they saw Robert's expression change before their very eyes, shifting from its usual blank stare to something like a frown or a smirk. Others swore they heard the sound of giggling coming from the doll. At times, Robert would be found sitting in different chairs or even moving rooms entirely on his own. And with these factors continuously at play, the Ottos began to realize that this was perhaps far more unexplainable than their son's mischief at play. When Gene later became an adult, he inherited the family home in Key West, known as the Artist House, where he lived with his wife, Anne. Although, to her utter dismay, Gene continued to keep Robert close, placing him in a chair in his studio as he painted. Anne was known to despise the doll and reportedly begged Jean to lock it away, but Jean consistently refused. Robert, it seemed, was not just a childhood toy. He was a lifelong companion. Jean died in 1974, leaving Robert behind in the artist's house. Of course, the house was resold, and the new owners moved in. But as they did, they stumbled across a now abandoned Robert sitting in the attic. Shortly after, they began to share stories of strange activity. They claimed that they could hear footsteps coming from above, with objects moving on their own. At times, they would even claim to hear voices. They decided Robert had to go, and he was later donated to the East Martello Museum in Key West, where he remains to this day. Although, even behind the glass he now resides, his legend has only continued to expand. Visitors to the museum often report cameras malfunctioning in Robert's presence, with some saying that photographs taken of him come out corrupted or blurred. Others even go so far as to say the devices stop working entirely until they leave the building. And due to this, a peculiar tradition has also formed, as guests are now told to always ask Robert's permission before taking his picture. Those who don't are said to suffer accidents, illness, or streaks of bad luck afterwards. Interestingly, letters of apology have even been written to Robert by previous guests, sent by people who believe they fell victim to his curse. The museum now displays stacks of these letters alongside the doll itself. To this day, Robert the doll sits in his case, dressed in his sailor suit and clutching a small toy of his own. His stitched smile has not changed in over a century. But just like Annabelle, many insist there is far more lurking behind those button eyes than mere cloth and stuffing. Then there's a tale of Ruby the doll, who's nowhere near as well known as Annabelle and Robert. Yet those who have come across her describe a haunting no less unsettling. However, Ruby's history, unlike many cursed objects, does not begin with a clear origin story. According to the accounts, Ruby had once belonged to a family who insisted the doll brought nothing but misfortune. Wherever Ruby was kept, tragedy seemed to follow. Her presence was said to coincide with accidents, illness, and a general sense of dread that settled over the household. Eventually, the family decided that they could no longer bear to keep her, and Ruby was passed on to another owner. However, she never stayed in one place for long, as each time she entered a new home, reports of strange occurrences would begin again. The most distinctive feature of Ruby's legend is not simply the bad luck that surrounded her, but the reaction people often described when handling her. Those who held the doll claimed to be overwhelmed by sudden, intense feelings of sadness. Some even reported visions or memories of loss, as though Ruby carried with her a grief that was not her own, but forced upon whoever came too close. This emotional weight was consistent enough across accounts that the doll was soon regarded as cursed. Eventually, Ruby found her way into the possession of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who believed the doll had been used in occult practices at some point in history, though they were never able to back this up. Out of caution, they ended up placing Ruby in their occult museum alongside Annabelle, where she would remain amongst the many dark artifacts that surrounded her. Visitors to the museum often reported the same atmosphere of melancholy around Ruby, as though the doll exuded a sorrow that seeped into the room itself. However, it is also worth noting that Once again, there is no verifiable evidence of any of this story's claims outside of the Warrens' narratives. Ruby's presence is often overshadowed by the more violent and far more dramatic presence of Annabelle, likely due to the different ways in which they affect their victims. If Annabelle is a catalyst for terror, then Ruby is a catalyst for sorrow. Regarding dolls, we know they're nothing but inanimate objects, and yet the strange familiarity in their eyes continues to unsettle us. A sensation that is not only connected to folklore, but to the human mind itself. Psychologists point to a concept known as the uncanny valley, which describes the disturbing effect of something that looks almost human, but is not quite. When a face is familiar, we trust it as one of ours, yet when it's clearly artificial, we register it as an object or digital creation instead. However, in the grey area between the two, where it's close enough to be almost convincing but not quite there, is where our discomfort is found. This is often why CGI characters always seem to be what we refer to as dead behind the eyes. They look completely human, and yet it does not trigger that familiarity within us, due to it being so heavily based on extremely subtle nuances in the human face that we don't pick up on in our conscious minds. This isn't random though, and there are evolutionary reasons for it. Our brains are hardwired to scan faces for signs of a threat, subconsciously studying for expressions, signs of life, and emotional cues. A doll gives us the outline of a face, but none of the cues we rely on to know what their intentions may be. It just stares endlessly, emitting a smile that holds no warmth, creating the illusion of life, whilst remaining dead still. It is within this absence of humanity where we expect to find it creates a tension within us, setting off subtle alarm bells that something is off, and it is during these alarms that we begin to project those fears onto it. Experiments conducted on the sensation of the uncanny valley consistently show increased activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, when people are shown almost human figures, further proving that we are quite literally biologically wired not to trust them. In fact, children's studies have also revealed that dolls are frequently personified more than other toys by the kids in the study, with them instinctually treating them as living beings with thoughts and feelings of their own. That being said, this isn't only psychological. We've already walked through how, in different places and eras, dolls were treated as more than toys. A doll in many traditions is a container for what can't be seen, whether that's hope, warning, or a lingering presence. With that in mind, it's clear the haunted doll is not a random invention brought forward by the likes of Annabelle, Ruby, or Robert. Instead, it is a phenomenon rooted in both culture and psychology around the world. Just like the way they appear human and yet not human at the same time, they exist in a blend of faith and fear. They're often given names, outfits, and even personality traits so often treated as real-life beings, ones we will never truly be able to read. It is within the balance of the scientific, the cultural, and the psychological that makes the haunted doll such a universal figure. From ancient ritual to modern horror cinema, dolls occupy the border between the human and the inanimate, the living and the lifeless. And it's in that borderland where humanity is seen, but never truly found, that our imagination breeds monsters.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Morgie. Co-edited by Sophie Tickle. Music by Billy Japp. With additional sounds from Storyblocks and Envato. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please like and review our show on your chosen podcast provider. This simple task is a big part of our show's continuation and growth. To access more chapters through our bonus material, early releases, ad-free content, and more, become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. To follow us on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, simply search Urban Legends Folklore or visit lukemorgie.com/podcast. If you have more information or a correction on anything said, email us on luke@lukemorgie.com. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority.